Alright, so today I want to show you 6 impossible ball python combinations where you're trying to make a certain combination or a mixture of genes and for whatever reason you actually can't make that combination. As a matter of fact, I actually had under one of my videos this week, someone left a comment and said, hey, I went over to the genetic calculator over on the world of ball pythons and I'm actually trying to make this combination and the genetic calculator won't let me make it. And sometimes it really depends on the genes that you're trying to work together. Sometimes you can mix certain genes together, and sometimes you actually have kind of this image in your head of a snake that you want to make as far as the visual appearance. And based on what we actually have in the ball python industry, it seems like you should be able to make that combination, and for some reason you just can't make it. As a matter of fact, I've actually had a lot of people ask me about the same combination, and as far as I know, you just can't make it. And then sometimes you'll actually have either a problem with the male or a problem with the female, where you'll get lethal combinations or you'll get combinations that are impossible to make because of the fertility of the female. So sometimes it can get pretty complicated. So today I want to jump over the internet and I want to show you 6 different impossible ball python combinations. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here at Morphmarket.com and I want to start with pretty much the #1 question. I've been asked this probably 5 or 6 times. A lot of people will ask, hey, is there any way I can make a completely black patternless snake that has red eyes? And as far as I know, there's really no way to actually make a black snake with the red eyes. And I wanted to show you a black snake first. This is essentially what people are talking about, is they're talking about this snake right here. And there's a few ways you can make a completely black snake. You can make one that's the super cinnamon, like this one right here. You can also make the super black pastel. A lot of times the super black pastels will be a little bit darker than the super cinnamons, but I've actually seen some super cinnamons that are super jet black. This is probably one of the darkest super cinnamons that I've actually seen. And then you can actually make the 8-ball, which is the combination of the cinnamon and the black pastel to make a completely black and patternless snake. And the only way that I know of to get red eyes in any snake is to use albino. And it's kind of interesting, there's a couple exceptions to that rule. It seems like every now and then, sometimes in the blue-eyed leucistics, I'll actually see some blue-eyed leucistics that have like a blue eye with a red pupil in the middle of the eye, which is kind of interesting, and I don't know what causes that. So I would say it's possible you can actually have some kind of a weird super cinnamon that kind of has a red pupil, but as far as I know, as far as the genetics and making that and reproducing it, I don't think there's any way to actually do it. So if you actually took the albino and worked it into the super cinnamon to give the super cinnamon the red eyes, essentially what you get is you'd end up with this snake right here, which is kind of an interesting combination. This is a super cinnamon albino, and look what the albino does to the super cinnamon. It completely turns it into a completely white snake, which is kind of surprising. It doesn't look like the albino with the yellow and the white, and it doesn't look like the super cinnamon that's completely black, but you did get the completely red eyes. The albino is pretty much the only gene that I know of to really bring in some really bright red glowing eyes in your ball python. So that's one I'm still working on. If you know of a way to actually make an all black snake with red eyes, I would definitely love to hear about it, but as far as I know, there's really no way to actually make one. So here's a question that I had just this week, and someone said, hey, I went over to the genetic calculator and I was trying to make a highway specter, so a highway with the addition of the specter gene. And the first thing I wanted to show you is a highway. This is what a highway looks like. And if you actually look at the genetics of the highway, it consists of the yellow belly and the gravel. And it's kind of interesting if you look at the yellow belly by itself and the gravel by itself, they almost look like normal ball pythons. They're almost hard to pick out the difference between those two genes and a normal. Both of them are in the yellow belly complex, and they come together to form a really impressive looking combination. So if you actually try to add the specter to this, so here's what the specter looks like, and the specter is also in the yellow belly complex, and this almost looks like a normal ball python. As a matter of fact, if you actually take a specter and you breed it to a yellow belly, 25% of the times you get a super super stripe, which is the combination of the specter and the yellow belly. And if you come over here to the genetic wizard and try to breed a highway specter and hit calculate, essentially what it says is it gives you an error. It errors out and says you can't select 3 genes from the same complex. So essentially what this is, you actually have the 3 genes that are all compatible, all allelic genes. I guess you can kind of think of it as, say for example, if you look at the pastel, you can have 1 copy of the pastel, you can have 2 copies of the pastel, which would be the super pastel, but you can't have 3 copies of the pastel. You can only have a maximum of 2 genes of any one single gene, or of any genes that are in the same complex that would be allelic with each other. In this case, it would be like kind of making like a triple pastel in one stick, which is impossible. So you can't actually have more than 2 genes in any certain complex, which gets a little bit confusing. All right, so take a look at this. This is kind of interesting. So number 3, I want to look at the Enchi in with the red axanthic. So the Enchi red axanthic is an impossible combination. And the Enchi, essentially what that does is it really reduces the pattern. Sometimes it actually brings out a lot of the oranges and yellows and a lot of your combinations. And the red axanthic, take a look at this. The red axanthic, it almost looks like an axanthic, like the recessive, the normal axanthics, but this is actually a codominant gene where you need 2 copies to get kind of this color, but with 1 copy of the red axanthic, the het red axanthic, you can actually see it in a lot of combinations. So a lot of times when we say het red axanthic, it's kind of a misnomer, because usually when we use het for genes in ball pythons, we're talking about a recessive gene and not a codominant gene. It's kind of weird that they named it het red and red axanthic. So kind of the interesting thing is they recently discovered that Enchi is allelic with cinnamon. So if you actually have a cinnamon Enchi, you breed it to something else, half the offspring come out as Enchi, half come out as cinnamon. You may have heard that just recently in the last couple of years. And kind of the interesting thing, if you think about the cinnamon is also allelic with black pastel, and it's also allelic with het red axanthic. So technically you couldn't have an Enchi red axanthic with 2 copies of the het red. You couldn't also have an Enchi super cinnamon, and you couldn't have an Enchi super black pastel, which is kind of interesting because all of them are in the same complex, and you'd actually have 3 genes in the same complex, which you can't have. All right, so for number 4, one of the impossible combinations is this one right here. This is actually a champagne spider. This is impossible. And you're probably scratching your head wondering, hey, if that's an impossible combination, how come you're actually showing a picture of the impossible combination? Someone actually made it. And most people will consider the champagne spider to be a lethal combination. And from what I've seen, most of the people that have actually done this pairing and made the champagne spider, they actually partially develop, or almost fully develop in the egg, and then they'll die before hatching or shortly after hatching, meaning you can actually make one, but it doesn't survive for very long, which is kind of an interesting characteristic of this combination. As a matter of fact, this is over on the World of Ball Pythons. If you come down here to the description down at the bottom of the page, it actually has a note on this. It says this combination has been known to not survive, and as of right now, the spider champagnes that have hatched have died shortly thereafter, even if they hatch at all. So it's kind of one of those weird combinations that I guess you can make one, but it just doesn't survive very long. And I can pretty much guarantee that nobody that I know of has even a subadult or an adult champagne spider. It's kind of an interesting combination. All right, so here's another one. So for number 5, you can't make a super desert. It's an impossible combination. So if you actually come over here on Morphmarket, where they have like almost 250,000 ball pythons listed over here, and you search for super desert, you actually won't find even a single one. And I actually brought up a picture of what a desert looks like. Take a look at how beautiful this is. And kind of the weird thing is I consider the desert to be one of the brightest genes in all of ball pythons that makes the brightest and the flashiest combinations that I've ever seen. As a matter of fact, I actually saw a YouTube video and someone was pulling out all these combinations out of the rack, and I was like, what are they doing that I'm not doing? Everything that they're pulling out is absolutely breathtaking. And come to find out, they were all desert combinations. And the problem with the desert is the females. As a matter of fact, this one right here is actually a female desert. And they kind of found out after they started working with the desert that the females have some kind of a problem as far as the fertility. I've seen some people breed the deserts, and a lot of people say that the females will lay all infertile eggs. And a lot of times when the desert females will lay their eggs, a lot of times they'll actually pass away. They'll die from the egg laying process. So most of the people breeding deserts, they'll say the females are pet quality only, don't ever breed a female desert. And as soon as they found that out, it pretty much just fell out of popularity. And you'll find a few deserts over here once in a while, people kind of playing around with them. It's kind of interesting. You'll actually see some really bright, really flashy combinations that have a lot of really high-end genes in with the desert. And they're really inexpensive, especially if it's a female with a lot of genes in there. You can actually find some really good deals if you're looking just for a really flashy pet ball python that you don't intend to breed over here. But the problem is you can't make the super, because in order to make the super, you'd have to breed a male desert to a female desert, and then when that female desert lays eggs, 25% of those eggs would be the supers. And since you can't get the females to lay the eggs, you can't get the super. So here's the last one I wanted to show you. This is the paradox. Can you actually get a super paradox? Some people have actually asked me this, and the paradox is kind of interesting. It's kind of just a random color on a snake that is not genetic for the most part, where you kind of get these random, unexpected colors on the snake. So you really can't breed for it in most cases. As a matter of fact, if you actually look at certain genes, potentially you could get a genetic paradox. And the only one that I really know of for sure is like the super cinnamon or the super black pastel. In a lot of those combinations, it seems like you have a really high probability of getting a paradox. It seems like almost all the super cinnamons have some kind of a paradox going on somewhere in the snake, which is kind of crazy. But for the most part, you really can't reproduce it. So if you actually took this snake, which is a spider, pinstripe, bamboo, and you bred it to something else, none of the offspring would come out with these random splotches of color called the paradox. And if it's not genetic, then you really can't make a super. If you actually did make a super and you bred it to something else, all the offspring would come out as paradoxes, which as far as I know, you can't do it. And kind of the interesting thing with paradox is I've actually seen some people that have a really strongly paradox snake, and it seems like when they breed those, they have a higher occurrence of paradoxing in the offspring, but it's not 50% and it's not genetic as far as we would think, as far as the genetics, like being dominant or co-dominant. And a long time ago, I actually read in one of the reptile forums, it's probably been maybe about 6 years since I actually read this, and I only read it once. Someone said that at one point there was actually a gene called the atomic gene, and some people thought it could possibly be a recessive paradox, where the paradox would be a recessive. You need 2 copies of the gene to actually make the paradox. I thought that was pretty interesting, but it seems like the atomic kind of fell out of pretty much fell off the map. I can't even find it over on Morphmarket, and no one really has proved out. I think maybe they thought it was recessive, and then they found out later that maybe it wasn't a recessive version of the paradox. Although it would be kind of interesting to go through Morphmarket and buy up everybody's paradoxes and breed them all together to see if you could possibly prove that one version of paradox would be genetic. That would be a pretty amazing project. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Cortland Bell asks, What should I breed to my Super Mojave Ball Python? And that is a very good question. I have a lot of people asking me, hey, I just picked up this Ball Python with these specific genes. What should I breed to my Ball Python? And there's a couple of things that I would actually breed to a Super Mojave. In the first one, I'd probably breed a Super GHI or a GHI with some other genes, because one of the combinations that I really love is the Mojave GHIs. Essentially, it's like a jet black snake with a really bright dotted line right down the top of the snake. I've actually seen some in person, and let me tell you, those things don't even look real. It's like they're made out of plastic or something, which is pretty crazy. So you can actually take your Super Mojave, breed it to a Super GHI, and get a whole clutch of Mojave GHIs, which would be pretty awesome. Or what you could do is you could find a GHI combination with some other genes. What I would actually do is I'd go over to Morphmarket.com, look at all the Mojave GHIs with other genes in the mix, and then see if you can actually get a GHI combination including some of those genes that make for a really visually impressive combination, and buy that snake and breed it to your Super Mojave, which would be pretty cool. Another thing I would actually do is if you're actually looking for completely white snakes with the blue eyes, especially with the Super Mojave, I would actually take that snake and breed it to a Super Lesser. So if you actually look at the Super Mojave, it's an all-white snake with blue eyes, but it has kind of a grayed out head with a lot of your Super Mojaves. And the Super Lesser is a really bright white snake, but a lot of times the Super Lessers can have bug eyes, like bigger than normal eyes, which is kind of interesting. So if you actually took a Super Lesser and you bred it to a Super Mojave, all the offspring would be Mojave Lessers, which a lot of people consider to be the ultimate blue-eyed leucistic. It could be completely white with no gray head or no color anywhere on the snake. It would have pretty much, most of them have perfect size eyes. They don't have the micro eyes or the bug eyes. And they have really bright blue eyes, which would be, you'd have a whole clutch of pretty much the ultimate blue-eyed leucistics with the Mojaves and the Lessers. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.